Make sure it's turned up.
It's not
Yeah,
off.
that's fine. It seems so. Have yours turned off? You can use this one, and then I'll have a copy.
Yeah, sure. Just a second, it's got me.
All right. We're a few minutes late later anyway.
Will that work? It's ready. Does the light not come on? Oh, it goes on. Okay. Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. You'll see that we missed the massive storm that we all got. At least my house missed it. Anyway, I hope yours did. So thank you for coming on what looked to be was going to be a pretty horrible night. I've just got a very few words to say. My name's Andrew Garnett. I'm the director of Centre for Coal Seam Gas here, but also the Carbon Capture and Storage Program. And I'm just going to invite you. I'm just going to say a few words of introduction, and I'm going to hand it over to the main show. So before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we gather and pay my respects to elders past and present. Tonight we've got Peta, who you all know, so I'm not going to introduce her. And we've got Dr. Yan Sun, who's a visiting prof with us from the Institute of Psychology, Chinese Academy of Science. Professor Yan Sun's interests are in understanding pro-environmental attitudes and behaviors in different cultural contexts. And his current research interests focus on how pro-environmental behaviors are shaped by the way information is given. Now, I've got some instructions to give you. First of all, I'm supposed to mention the Masters of Sustainable Energy students. You're supposed to stand up and put your hands up. You're supposed to stand up and put your hands up, right? Oh, bloody hell, lots of them. So these guys are going to be networking furiously with you. I'm not sure they're after money, but they're after sort of contacts and interests. Oh, they might be. I suspect if you offer money, they'll probably take that too. The second piece of housekeeping is this thing on the board here. So Peter's going to run some polls during the evening. And so those of you with a mobile phone, if you text that number, you don't need the +61 if you're an Australian phone. You just need 427, text that, and that will get you ready for the poll questions which come later in the day, in the evening rather. I think that's going to run swimmingly. Have you done that before, Peter? Oh, okay, fine. Yeah. All right. No, that's very good. Yeah. So that's the second piece of housekeeping. The third piece of housekeeping is the standard fire safety stuff. There's no drill plan for today. We've got a 2-stage alarm system. Beep, beep, whoop, whoop, beep, beep happens. Basically just ready to go, and whoop, whoop happens. We'll go straight outside, and we will muster out by, when you came in the door there, we go up the yard, up to this little circle, we'll muster up there. So before I go much further, here at UQ at the moment we've got a very large CCS project going on, which is looking at whether it's a real option in certain parts of the country. But a large part of that study is actually on the social science and the technology acceptance part, which Peter's going to talk a little bit about today. So the Australian part is in that context. On the international scene, you've all seen recently the Paris Agreement, and it's looking increasingly like the 2 degrees C is somewhere between myth and legend, if we're ever going to make it. The IEA recently have been showcasing CCS as one of the ways forward for major reduction of emissions. And some of you may have seen the Australian Today where Fatih Birol was suggesting certain fiscal incentives for it, picking up from lessons in the US. Whether we do that or not, of course, is a different question. Both Australia and China have got strong reliance on fossil fuels. So these two guys here decided to run a comparative study on public understanding, and that's what you're going to be seeing tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Peta, and then she's going to start with a song, I believe. Is that right?
No, not tonight. That's later, after drinks. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Alf. And thanks everybody for coming. And I do hope you've logged in because it's fun to compare a national survey against a room survey to see what people think. Okay. All right. Yes, I can press and you can have that. So we're going to do a tag, Jan and I, and this is the title of our presentation. So looking at technologies in China and Australia, and as Alf said, we're comparing national surveys. We're only going to do a light touch because there's a lot of information that we've been delving into, which is partly why Jan's visiting, to sort of do this work together. And I just want to acknowledge the team. It's a team effort. I'm standing up here on behalf of many of my lovely social science researchers. Kathy's here. Obviously, she's done a lot of the work with the numbers this week for Jan and I. Claudia has actually moved offshore. Alex has done some work on GIS, and Amy is a PhD student working in this area, and she's actually provided input. And just to acknowledge the funding for this survey, as Alf said, comes from this range of people, and it's called the UQ Surat Deep Aquifer Appraisal Project. And read the obvious disclaimer. Okay, Jan.
Okay, I also want to thank my team member, but the most thing I think tonight is the Chinese holiday, the most holiday in China, just like the Christmas evening in West. I want to tell you the rule is in this night, if you see some good thing, that will make you lucky in the next 1 year. For example, you can shoot some good thing. For example, you can say your talk just good. Thank you. The next year is the year of the dog in Chinese. The outline, the presentation outline.
Yeah, John.
Our presentation setting the scene, some result about knowledge, preference, trade-off, and then we'll share a video, and then we'll have your opinion, more result, and summary, and then the question. This is the outline. Okay, the questionnaire in Australia, Peta in charge of this side, I in charge of the Chinese side. The survey item includes perceived knowledge, the support for technology and public funding, preference, economic trade-off, climate change, and the perception of CCS, and the personal information. The whole questionnaire is same. Is almost the same. So we can compare directly compare the difference between two countries.
I think it says it all. It's just reinforcing what Alf said before around where most of our electricity, I guess the size of the challenge of what makes up the mix here in Australia. We just thought it's interesting as to why, we're looking at Australia and China. I think there's this strong reliance on fossil fuels, yeah? Next one, Jan?
That's the Australia thing, situation. The China situation, as you can see, the power generation in the whole energy picture, the coal is the biggest pie. Next is hydro power. The other thing is almost the least. So the most important in China in today still is the coal. That's it.
Yep. Okay, so why do we look at public attitudes? I think a big thing we know here is around whenever you're thinking of large technologies or new power infrastructure, we get this objection. We know there's lots of moratoriums, even the wind farm down in country Victoria. Wherever you go, it really doesn't matter which technology. So actually trying to understand how people perceive and respond and understand more about their decision making can actually help tailor messages that might sort of let them reflect a little bit more about this. And I guess this boils down to that idea of social license to operate, which many of you would be familiar with, the ongoing acceptance or approval of an operation by those local community stakeholders who are affected by it and who can affect its profitability. The thing that we often say, hard to earn but very easy to lose. And I guess I'm actually on the Northern Territory fracking inquiry at the moment, and a big issue there for many of the Northern Territory is this social licence. It's the biggest question, I think, for the inquiry, because when they look at the technical side, they're quite happy that the risk can be managed. And I think with carbon capture and storage, I've been working in this area for about, I don't know how many years now, quite a long time. And there's several colleagues here that I've met along the way. And I guess one of the big things is that this social risk has become a commercial showstopper for so many projects. And it's not just about fossil, sometimes the different renewable energies as well. So looking at these national surveys provides some insight into government when they're thinking about policy. And then the way that we've structured the survey is actually to start to experiment a little bit with what happens with information. So Jan, I might get you to talk to China.
Yes. Let's look at the China situation. The left picture, that's China, maybe 20 years ago, not now. The right picture is China today. So you can see the bottom one shows the air pollution. So generally, people hate the pollution. They also think that the pollution led by the coal, so they generally didn't like the coal burning, something like that. That public attitude will be showed in the application or something talk in the mirror blog or just like Twitter. So according our result, generally people want to use the new technology, didn't like the traditional energy. That's the general picture. Next part is our survey result. Here is our sample. For Australia, there are 2,500 people. For China, 1,300 people. The gender information, the age information, the age group information, as you can see. As you can see that in the sample, the age in Australia is older in the Chinese people.
Do you want to say why there was a small percentage of Chinese and older people?
Why this thing? Because maybe I think because the older Chinese people is hard to use the internet or use the smartphone, because our survey is uses the online way. That's the participants distribution. The dark color means more people. as you can see, at the Inner Mongolia, in Beijing, in Shandong, and in Guangdong, that's there are more people in this area. So, but in some Yunnan and Fujian, there are few people. Here is the Australia sample distribution. The red one means the more sample. Right, Peter?
Yeah, so what we actually did, we're not representing these results, but those square blocks are places where we oversampled. So we've got another 200 in each of those. They're not included in our analysis tonight. And if you think about why they were chosen, we've got Queensland up the top around the Surat Basin, Victoria around Gippsland where Hazelwood is closed, and then South Australia obviously around renewables and so forth. So they were sort of selected to think about what happens, because what our hypothesis is, and what I've seen is that urban and regional may have a different attitude, and there's this sense of familiarity that builds up with technologies if you grow up with them in your backyard. So we're trying to test some of those hypotheses.
Good. As you see that there are more people in Australia because Peta lead this survey. I just use a compared sample in China. So if later if you have some question want to ask, the easy question ask me. The hard question ask to Peta. Please remember.
Thanks,
The next part, first we ask the Australia and the Chinese people about the self-rating knowledge about energy technologies. As you can see, people think they know about more. They know more about gas, the solar, the coal, but they didn't know biomass, the CCS. That's the Australia result.
It was on a score of 1 to 7 too.
Yeah. For China, it's the rank is almost the same, but generally the score is higher in China. The CCS is the red one. So the key difference, we can see that the Chinese tend to rate their knowledge of energy technology higher than Australian. But why? Maybe I think maybe because the sample is younger, they are more educated, so they know about knowledge. That makes sense. The second one, second difference, the least knowledge in both countries for biomass and CCS. That is the same for the two countries. Oh.
Okay, to me?
Okay.
Yep, okay. So the idea of testing people's knowledge is actually, because then when we ask them how much they support it, people that rate their perceived knowledge higher tend to show more support or have stronger opinions. So it was actually there, just what did they think they knew. Then what we did is actually gave some example definitions to actually give people that information. Very broad, very simple information, but for each of those technologies. And then we would ask them their level of support based on, when you read this technology, what do you think? And again, it was on 1 from strongly disagree with it to 7 strongly agree. And if we have a look, pretty much this survey, we've replicated these surveys over the years when I was at CSIRO with colleagues in Japan and in UK and Sweden. And what happens is you tend to get this strong leaning towards the wind and solar, the renewables. Okay, so everybody likes the idea of renewables, and that's interesting. Take note at the other end, because when we flip to China, the ones at the bottom of Australians' preferences. So we've got coal seam gas, biomass, nuclear, and coal. Coal is tolerated, or it's not the bottom. But when we flip to China, we have a different story. Not so much at the top, right? The preferences are the same. People prefer or they support them. CCS is a little bit lower, but look, biomass has started to move up. Nuclear, further up. And if you think how much nuclear power and hydroelectric and so forth, but coal is at the bottom. And we've been thinking about this as we analyse results a little bit more around, you know, the links to pollution. And we're actually starting to see coming through, as we'll share some more results, that maybe the Chinese think that carbon capture and storage will solve the solution problem, which actually it won't in many ways, because it's only cleaning up the CO2. Is there anything else you want to say about that, Jan?
Yeah.
We'll keep going.
Next.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, we can see there's strong support for solar and wind across both countries, because that technology means the safe and green technology. Another difference, China shows higher support for CCS. That is definitely score, not in the reg. Another different, China has little support for coal. As I said before, I think maybe this is caused by the pollution. People hate coal. So another difference, China shows higher support for biomass and nuclear. Biomass, usually I ask some people, what do you think about the biomass? They told me biomass is good. It's good. Uses waste food, uses the leaf, uses other things. Is pretty green. So the biomass should be safe. Another reason maybe the Chinese national government have many policy to support some company to develop the biomass. I think maybe so that leads the Chinese people support the biomass. Okay.
Yep. So the next question we then asked to sort of test that support was actually, we asked them, if you're able to allocate government funds to all of these technologies, they had to move them across to 1 being their least preferred, no, 12 being their least preferred and 1 being most. So in this instance, a small number has higher preference. And it's actually quite interesting when you start ranking, there's a little bit of movement in the technologies. And I guess that's what we're interested in investigating, I suppose. So Australia was consistent with the solar preferences in so many ways, but we start to get a bit of divergence. Look what happens with wind here. It's 3rd for Australia, but in China it hits the 9th ranking. And I think we're still trying to unpick and probably need to do some more investigation. And then this other one about biomass. Obviously the Chinese, we've been sort of thinking about that, as Jan was saying, about, you know, the use from waste and what do people see as the potential. It's quite unusual and a significant difference. And also, even with coal comes bottom in China, and it doesn't in Australia. You know, so I think there is some significance around the pollution and so forth with what's going on here. Carbon capture and storage, bang on, they both had 8. When we start to unpick this into our regions, which I'm not going into tonight, you actually see differences between Queensland, South Australia and Victoria. To test that a little bit more, we then went on to say, tell us, based on those rankings, which of these influenced you on a scale of 1 to 7? Why did you choose them? We haven't showed the significance here, but environmental protection, climate issues. So the economic was that it would, you know, if you were doing that, it might bring jobs and new skills. The cost to install, price of electricity, reliability and location. You can imagine which one was highest in South Australia when we asked. Shall I keep going with this for a minute? Yeah? Yeah? So what Kathy's been doing is actually doing some correlations and regressions to see, well, you know, from a social science perspective, which ones of these seem to influence. And we looked at carbon capture and storage and renewables, where we lumped them together. And we did see some differences start to emerge across the country. So the factors that had a positive support for people choosing carbon capture and storage higher was the economy, or their support for CCS, cost, which was around infrastructure rather than electricity cost, and reliability. So there was a perception by some people in there that that would help maintain reliability. But if you were strong on environmental issues or belief in climate change, those people don't see carbon capture and storage as being the answer. I don't think that's surprising, but I think it's something to think about when we're thinking about messaging of technologies, because quite often, you know, it's the long end of the IEA is that this is going to save us from the 2 degrees by capturing all of the CO2. In China, the concern for environmental issues and also location, and there'll be a link to this later, but quite often when we're doing these workshops to experiment in developing countries, people say, well, we're here, and if we've got to have carbon capture and storage, why should we have all the risks in our backyard when we're doing a global benefit? You don't get that so strongly in the Chinese population, and we've got some tests that Jan will talk about later as to why. So what were the issues? Not surprising, if you were concerned about environmental issues and climate change, you had stronger correlation support for renewables, reliability, interesting one, and electricity price, a smaller significance. Negative was based around the cost of solar thermal, wasn't it? That seemed to come out as a negative. In China, environmental issues, climate change, reliability were the reasons that tended to show support for renewables. So when we've done that, so that's sort of taken you through some of them. What we then did was actually show people a small piece of information, which is a video. In China, because of the internet restrictions and just using too much of people's Wi-Fi, we actually did it as text. But I'm just going to share that with you now. And according to Semso, I can swipe, right? Semso? It didn't work. Semso, take me back.
This is our world. Over the next 40 years, the global population will grow from 7 to 9 billion people. And by 2030, our energy demand will have risen by 50%. Today, fossil fuels, coal, gas and oil, supply 80% of the world's energy needs. A reality that is set to continue for decades to come, until renewables become our main source of energy. But here's the problem. When we burn fossil fuels, we emit enormous quantities of carbon dioxide, or CO2, too much of which leads to global warming and the irreversible effects of climate change. So how can this be avoided? As a first step, we need to cut our expected emissions by 50% over the next 20 years, and that's not much time. A solution is greater energy efficiency, more renewables, and CO2 capture and storage, or CCS, a technology which has the potential to capture half the world's current CO2 emissions. And here's how it works. Most of these emissions come from power plants, heavy industry, and refineries, the largest emitters of CO2. CCS can capture at least 90% of these CO2 emissions before it's transported in liquid form by pipeline or ship and stored safely and permanently far below the Earth's surface. This process simply imitates how nature has stored oil, gas and CO2 for millions of years. But CCS must be deployed rapidly and widely, or we won't reduce our emissions on time. That's why this combination of CCS, renewables, and energy efficiency will lead us to the sustainable energy systems of the future. ZEP, the EU's authority on CCS.
Okay, so it was about trying to find something publicly available that gave us a bit of an impression. That's it. So now, it's back to you guys. Hopefully you've all, if you haven't already, you've got your phones or your devices ready to vote. When we actually we did that, we actually asked these questions. There's one about CCS. I'm going to ask the climate change question as well so we can compare. But what happened is we randomised the order to try and take away any bias. So they'd see that video and they'd get asked the question about carbon capture in first, half of the sample. The other half would get asked about renewables. So it's a way of sort of eradicating some order bias in how they did that. So first question, fingers crossed. So, right, people are already voting. Do you believe global warming is happening now or will happen in the next 30 years? So plug in your number, it's totally anonymous. There's the numbers up there if you missed them before, 0427 541. Actually, we need a number counter. Sorry, I haven't got that. But does anyone need any more time? A few more minutes, a few seconds. It should signal that it's been accepted or something, yeah? So we've got, at this stage, 91% of those who voted say it's already happening. Someone says it will happen. Oh, no, they've changed their mind. It's not happening and we will not. Or I don't know and I'm not sure, 6% of the room. Got a photo, Semso? Okay, next one. This actually came from risk perception work that was done in nuclear before, and we've applied it with carbon capture. So you've watched the video, what are your, even just from your own knowledge, the advantages of renewable energy as a carbon reduction option outweigh the risks? Neither. The risks of renewable energy outweigh its advantages, or I don't know. Okay. Okay, so we're sort of moving between, oh, someone doesn't know, there's a group. So more see the advantages, we got the photo. I'm going to show you what the national samples said after this. Somebody's got the risk, no. Maybe bats, bird kill. Okay, carbon capture and storage, what do we think in the room? Advantages outweigh the risks. The risks outweigh its advantages, neither. I don't know. It's one of these fun ways to get a feeling for what's going on in the room. It's also very good if it's a contentious issue and people don't want to say. You can use this as a way of sort of checking in what people are thinking. Okay, so we've got 53% think the advantages outweigh the risks, 14% the other side, and 16% neither.
Yes.
So
yeah, CCS 50, almost 50.
Yeah. So do you talk to this one?
Oh, let's see the result from our survey. The left is China, the right is Australia. The blue means yes, it's already happening. Where's the number?
Our numbers dropped off, but it was around 82% for China.
Yeah,
and 67.
Yes,
Right,
maybe 82.
Yep.
Australia maybe 67. That is the yes, it's already happening. The red means it will start happening in the next 30 years.
And that was 9 for Australia.
Yes, the green one means no, it's not happening and won't. The purple one is I don't know, I'm not sure. Okay.
So that, I think it's interesting to look at that, how small the population in China that was sampled or surveyed. Don't think it's happening. So that skepticism seems to have disappeared quite a lot.
Yeah.
Did you want to share a bit about that with the government? And
Yes, maybe I think for the Chinese people, people have more trust in government relative to the Australian people, to the government. So because the Chinese government say the climate change should be controlled, so people think it should be that. Another reason I think maybe people think yes, it is already happening because the younger sample. Another reason maybe the people was asked, do you believe the climate change? People usually think that is a scientific finding. I should say that, yes, it is. Otherwise, I will be seen as a stupid person. So, so we get a bigger pie in China for this option. Okay?
yep, you can go to the next one.
Oh, that's a result think about renewable energy. Again, China has a higher percentage than Australia, right?
Yep.
Okay.
I think this room had even higher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems almost the same thing. About the CCS, China had 55% support CCS. Australia is lower. 50% almost the same with in today.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Let's see about at the ending of the questionnaire, we asked a cultural value question. I'm a social psychologist, so I want to see whether the cultural value can predict the energy attitude. Hofstad is an important psychologist in psychology field. He identified 6 dimensions about a cultural difference between countries. This time in this survey, we used 2 dimensions. The one dimension is the future orientation. The second is the collective dimension. The future orientation, what means future orientation? That means when a person overweighted the value, the future value, compared to the benefit now. That is the we call that FTP. We found that the FTP dimension can be a significant predictor of support for CCS in both Australia and China. I think that is important because at an individual level, cultural dimension can directly indicate or predict the energy attitude. Let's take the second one, the collective dimension. The collective person, what mean the collective person? That means if I am a collective person, I value more the benefit of group rather than myself. Otherwise, the reverse is true. So we found that collective dimension is only a significant predictor of support for CCS in China, but not in Australia. So for the whole survey, we can see that FTP, the future orientation dimension, is a new finding for our survey relative to the traditional survey. Oh, thank you.
Yep. And I think also if you relate back to the Chinese around location, there was a positive predictor for support. I think there's something in there in the way, and not surprising, their collective approach as opposed to a developed world's probably more individualistic values. So that's basically, we're just going to wrap up. So motivations for support are reinforced by these external contexts of what's going on. So this idea of what's happening in China around pollution, I think it's interesting. I think also, as Jan talked about, this massive change in what's happening in China from 20 years ago to now, with them being able to protest the concerns about pollution. There's a level of accountability now, which is actually starting to come through in some of this thinking. I do think it's interesting to think about what's happening with the coal there as well, and carbon capture. So there's some stuff we have to clarify. So in Australia, if you're concerned about climate change, you tend to not support CCS, but in China you do. And that's probably what we evidence in our day-to-day life. There are these cultural differences emerging, which we need to unpick a little bit more. And I guess with where we're going from here now is, can we run some experiments to unpick this a little bit? And some of the work that the PhD students are working on is actually trying to work a little around message testing, so we can start to be informed by some of this survey work into some nuances of how you talk about technologies and what that happens. And we're hoping again to do some comparative work. I mean, we're very lucky that Jan could find some funds to run this in China.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's Brisbane at night.
So just before, I'm going to go into some questions now, but just before we go into some questions, maybe you just turn to the guy or the lady next to you and just share some initial impressions. Just while you're doing that, I'll just have a chat with you. So everybody just talk up your name. You can introduce yourself to David.
That's okay. No question.
Oh, wait, he's just having a chat. All right, Semso is going to run around with the microphone. Does anyone have any questions? Semso? Yeah? Does anyone have a... Oh, in the front, Marty.
Well, two questions. The first one is the obvious difference between surveys in China and Australia is a big difference in age distribution. Particularly in China, there was very few older people. Now, I wonder if you can segregate that out. So if you just sort of compare equivalent age rates in China and Australia, you then be able to take out that uncertainty.
Yep.
And the second question I'll pose is that in Australia, most people already, we drive cars, we have air conditioners, we already have this stuff, and we don't want to give it up. If you accept that global warming is a real threat, then morally the implications you would have to then be prepared to give up what you've already got. As compared to in China, when many people don't have cars, who don't have all these high energy using things, so they wouldn't have to give up what they don't already have, so they must be more accepting of the fact that global warming is a threat.
Thank you. Your question. First, I agree with you. Your first suggestion that we should do that. Do a compare. You use the same sample, the comparable sample to check the result. For the second one, I want to say the fact that today many Chinese people have a car, but not in not a small city. In Shanghai, in Beijing, the big city, many people have one family usually has two cars. To be honest, I don't think that's a lucky thing. I think that's a disaster. There is so many people in China. Each person has a car. What happening in future? Maybe in the I think in the big city, I think it is a similar situation between China and Australia. Maybe in the small city, I agree with you. That is a totally different thing. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Is that the difference between the person? This is it good?
Is it working? Use this one. Thank you.
Hello?
Yeah, then I'll turn that one.
Yeah, turn that one.
Yes, but yeah. Do you think that the difference between the Australian people and Chinese people about global warming is coming or not? Australian people actually, I live in Tehran. It's one of the most polluted cities in the world. And I live in Brisbane in the last 6 years. And when people talk about global warming, people don't see any pollution. So they maybe, do you have any of these things in your account? And that maybe because Chinese people every day can see the pollution, so they have a sense of global warming. But in Australia, we haven't seen such a thing. We have a very nice weather, and we can't sense it.
Well, obviously they can see the pollution, but I think that's what was coming through with the confusion about carbon capture and storage. That if we support that, it will actually clean up the pollution, but it's carbon capture and storage is cleaning up the carbon dioxide emissions. So I think it actually sort of suggests that that's what people are, and this sort of the strong sense of coal. I think there's some confusion there around what that actually means, I suppose. But then, as Jan said, this strong sense of science and trust in science. So I think that there's something there as well, which we know there's a lot of discussion here in Australia and in America and other developed countries around the public erosion of trust in science. And I think that that's, and part of climate change was one of those wicked problems that brought that about. So I think that could be a difference too. I think this is the fun part of social science when you start to look across countries. Probably got one more question and then it might be time for drinks, I think. I don't know. Well, there's two people. So we'll start here, and then up the back.
Thank you very much. That's fascinating research. How much of the research might show division by identity? So in the United States, we have people who I would argue vote against their own interests. They're not making any money as a result of the fossil fuel industry, but maybe their job is tied to it, or they're a Republican and the politics of that have them associate with the interests of the fossil fuel industry. Versus in China, where I don't know if there are any kinds of divisions like that by identity.
So one thing we did in the Australian one, we asked people's voting preferences, so we get to unpick that data, and absolutely we also asked whether you had a friend or family that worked in coal or gas, so that's exactly tapping into that identity and strong preference we've seen. Sorry? Yeah, so, and when we look into those, the different communities, South Australia, strong preference for renewable energy, more tolerant of coal seam gas in Queensland in the Surat, and actually sort of tended in Victoria as well to support coal. So we did. China, we didn't so much, did we, with voting?
You mean whether the participants know the pollution or the...
Did they show any preference by self-identity, by how they identify?
We just asked them to tell us. They just tell us the self-rating result. We also asked a question about whether your job is associated with the energy field. Some people also rating this item. So we also can check whether this score is related to our result. Thank you.
Turn that off so everything works. Sorry.
All right. My question goes to how much people know about the options they're being given in the questions. And obviously people are very familiar with things like solar, coal, which are bandied around in the media or everywhere. But some of the other options are much less known, and whilst some definitions are thrown at people or put up just before they answer the thing, I'm not sure that that's sort of necessarily fully gives them a clue of what they're about. And I look at for example, the biomass definition that was there, I think was about burning biomass, but whereas there are a whole host of other biodigesters and things like that, where you put anything from sewage treatment stuff to green waste to anything in biodigesters, and there's 10,000 of those in Germany and right through India and those. So some of the things I'm just wondering if there is enough actual information for whoever's trying to take the test as to really what's going on.
I think that's right, yeah. I mean, you've hit the challenge on the head. We've been looking at different ways of how do you portray information to get people understanding it, and even with biomass, there's so many components to it. a little while ago, we actually developed those different definitions. They were peer reviewed by a few different people. They were taken from the literature, but it's a challenge, absolutely, and the complexities around the trade-off. So this is only indicative, and I think that's where starting to work on different technologies in those focus groups is where you start to get more of the richer dialogue around what that might be. We often would bring an expert, whether it's geothermal or carbon capture and storage and so forth, to be able to talk to people. So this gives a broad brush, and it really is just that sort of immediate side of things, and then you try and delve in. And then the other question is, how do you give that information that's seen as credible, impartial, not pushing one over another, and those. So they're all the complexities of this. But one of the things that I believe very strongly is that we need to build people's literacy around this if we're going to make tough decisions, and I don't think there's anyone in this room that would disagree with that. I was interested, Marty had an Energy Information Centre for Queensland Government back in the 90s. You know, so where is all of those? So I think there's a lot